Hey, I see federal government contractors constantly struggling to define or hit their goals, right? So sometimes it's hard for people even to say, what is our goal? 5 million, 10 million, 1 million, or where are we getting it from? Or when they define it, sometimes I hear them struggling to reach that, right? Even though they're pretty good at saying, hey, we want $5 million year after year, maybe they're defining a goal, but not hitting it. And I would submit that if you're not hitting your revenue goals, your number goals, one reason could be that you're not walking the right path. You might be walking path number 3 when path number 1 is the right path for you. And so I'm going to talk about the 3 paths to making money in the federal government, in the federal market today, and in this training. And there are only 3 paths. And I don't care if you're in the manufacturing product side, the construction side, or the services side, professional services side, where I play most at, right? There's only 3 ways to make money. You can subcontract under a small business prime contractor. You can prime contract directly with an agency, or you can subcontract under a large prime contractor. And you'll see why I separate out the small and the large subcontracting. They truly, really are 2 different things. And but today I want to talk to you about how you can look at those and how you can begin to plan success in there. If you don't know who I am, my name is Neil McDonnell. I'm the president of the GovCon Chamber of Commerce, and I'm excited that you're here for my federal sales training, where we provide tips for success in the federal market. I spent 20 years as an IT professional in an IT services small business company in the federal market. And since 2018, I've been teaching people like you that government contracting is not a secret. It's just a process. All right, let's get rock and rolling on the 3 different paths to federal revenue success, right? And the first one we're going to talk about is small business subcontracting. Hopefully, if you've been to my training before, you've heard this before. If you haven't, I talk about there's 3 ways, 3 paths to making revenue in the federal market. And it's important to understand these, right? And so small business subcontracting, your company under a small business, is the first way. And I have some bullets here I just want to talk about, help you think about this. But both if you're a large company or a small, if you're new to government contracting, if you've been around, it's still the same thing. You want to have a plan for making money out of each of these 3 paths. So the small business path, it's great. My favorite reason is because most small businesses are willing to talk to other smalls as you're getting started. So if you're newer to the game, go knock on the door of small businesses. Try to build a relationship with some of these people and get in, right? When we get people into our workshop, we're always driving them towards subcontracting with smalls. If they're bigger, we take them down the other paths as well. But if you're newer, your first $3 million in federal contracting dollars should be through a small business subcontracting. It should not be through federal agency prime contracting, and it should not be through large business subcontracting. It could be, right? It should not be. I believe you should really be in the your first 3 years, or your first 3 million in subcontracting should be under a small business, so you can learn the ropes. You can get a facility clearance. You can understand how to bill out. You can get mentored by somebody who's been there before you. There's many years ahead of you to make lots of money as a prime or working with larges. For now, start with the small business subcontracting. That's the path to go if you're just getting started. And I don't mean first $100,000, your first 3 million. I'm serious about that. Give yourself time to get very good at government contracting before you start going forward. Just as a quick sidebar, right? If you ever consider 8A, don't ever get your 8A until you got $3 million at least subcontracting with a small, in a particular agency of choice, and you've learned the contracting officers' names. Then get your 8A, because it's only a 9-year window. You don't want to use any of that time learning how to sell, or learning how to deliver to the federal government, or learning how to get a clearance, right? You want all those in place and then get your 8A. That was a little sidebar. So think about why teaming with a small business, subcontracting under a small business, is really valuable to you if you're a small or large, right? One is you can get access to their set-asides. And so in the federal market, basically opportunities come out and they're set aside full and open, total small, or one of the 4 small business programs: woman-owned, service-disabled, veteran-owned, HUB-zone, and 8A. So one of those 6 is where the set-aside is. If you subcontract with small businesses, you get access to those set-asides. So for a small business that's a veteran-owned, if you team up with a woman-owned business, you get access to those women-owned set-aside contracts by subcontracting under a small business. If you're a large, same thing applies to you, right? You get access to that. One of my favorite, and I feel like this is a kind of a little known path for people to follow, but you get access to to the hub zone price preference. And this is in full and open opportunities, right? Not set aside to small, but in full and open opportunities. Let's say $100 million opportunity, right? And $25 million opportunity, it doesn't matter, but a large opportunity, larger opportunities. When you go after that, if you do capture correctly, you can make sure that they've got the hub zone price preference in there. And what this does is gives the hub zone prime contractor that you would sub under. So a hub zone is a small business with the hub zone certification. When they're going after something and you're subbing under it, you both get now the ability to have a 10% price preference. What it basically means is if you and a competitor go in and you both have a $10 million proposal, your proposal will be considered a $9 million, right? Or theirs will be bumped up by 10%. But either way, you get that price preference. It's something in the FAR. If you're a hub zone company, you absolutely want to learn this. But if you're somebody who's looking to go after bigger opportunities that might, and they're full and open, think about going together with a hub zone prime contractor, a hub zone small business, because you can get that price preference put in there. And if you do, now your price becomes a lot more competitive, right? You make it as competitive as possible, but then it gets a 10% price preference on that as well. So it's a great thing to have access to, the hub zone price preference. And the last one is, last point I want to make on just subbing to a small business is that as a large, you get access to the 125 billion or so that's awarded each year to small business prime contractors. And in the federal government, right, there's $650 billion that's basically contract dollars, right? Forget about that trillions. There's no such thing as trillions. That's a different number. The world we play in, it's about $600 billion, 650, depending on what happens, they might change the budget. But right around 125 billion of it is pretty consistently being set aside to small businesses. It's awarded to small business prime contractors. If you're a large business, then you should be thinking about how can I get a piece of that 125 billion? Well, the way you get a piece of it is to subcontract under a small. Now you get access to all that small business set aside contract dollars. So it's a great idea to think about it. So when you're thinking about your three paths, the first path is subbing under a small business. So go ahead and put, if you're tracking along with me in the first path, subbing under a small. Just put subbing under a small in the chat. Okay, so the second path on the three paths to federal revenue is to prime contract with an agency. So you already heard me say, if you're new to the game, subcontract under a small for the first 3 million and try to keep it as much as you can to the same agency or at least the same department. For example, try to keep it all within DHS. That way, when you start to go priming and you want to start priming, you've got agency knowledge, which I'll talk more about in a second. But so the second path is prime contracting directly with an agency. First bullet I want to point out is that agencies are always looking to work with new procurement-ready small businesses, right? And so when I talk about are you ready, I mean that you have subcontract with small businesses or largest, but you subcontracted in their agency is an even bigger plus, right? It makes you ready. But if you've done work within the federal agency, then you've got experience. And so that's one thing they're okay with saying you're ready, well, procurement ready. The second thing is you have 3 past performances, not one, not 2, but 3 past performances. These can be subcontracting past performances. It's totally okay if you come in and say, hey, I don't have a prime past performance, I have this. If you're going after an opportunity that requires you have prime past performances, then probably you're going after an opportunity that's too big for you right now. There's a lot of opportunities where they just want to know you have experience and they'll count your subcontracting. In fact, capture is all about ensuring that the contracting officer will count sub or prime contracting for past performances, right? They won't count that on a bigger contract, but they'll definitely consider it on smaller ones. And then the last one is you have someone on your team who's, and this goes back to, are you ready to prime contract with an agency? You must have somebody on your team who's ready to manage a contract. And this might seem like such a simple statement, right? But subcontracting under a small or large is not the same as prime contracting. Prime contracting, you've got all this administrative activity that your prime and previously has been taking care of for you. All you've been doing is having people work on the contract and submitting an invoice. Now you got a lot more reporting activity that goes on, a lot more administration. It's not like you can't do it. All I'm saying is you need to make sure you have somebody who's going to be dedicated to making sure you manage the contract, because one of the biggest things in sales is making sure you keep your current customers happy. It's not enough to land a customer. but you want to keep them happy, not just so you can keep them the next year and the next year, but so they're not bad mouthing you to somebody else saying, yeah, I took a chance and it didn't work out. And so have somebody on your team who's going to take that responsibility. It could be you, or it's time to hire somebody, right? So these are just 3 tips that I gave you about, are you ready to prime? It's not necessarily the inclusive list, the all-inclusive list of, are you procurement ready? But basically, if you've been subcontracting for $3 million in a small business world, and now you're trying to prime, you're probably procurement ready. A couple other things I just want to point out as it relates to prime contracting with an agency as a path to federal revenue is that when you start going in there, you can get access as a small business. You can get access to contracts that are under 250K. They call them simplified acquisition. And basically, it just means if it's under 250K, they try to keep the paperwork to a minimum, not guaranteed, but that's kind of the whole idea. But everything under 250 is automatically set aside to small businesses. And so you want to get in while you're subcontracting with small businesses, right? You want to get into the agency and start developing some relationships and understand how can you find out about these opportunities. It's one thing to see them in tools. It's another to see them or talk to a contracting officer or somebody in the know, small business specialist, who can guide you toward those opportunities, whether it's on a forecast or some other tool. But most likely, you want to find somebody you're talking to. That's business development, right? Business development is all about identifying opportunities. But when you go to an agency to prime, you've got access to that simplified acquisition, which is awesome. And then the last thing about prime contracting, and I think this should be kind of a given, but I'll just mention it, is that as you start prime contracting, the great thing about it is you can slowly but steadily keep getting larger and larger contracts. So you can get a couple $250,000 contracts, which enables them to trust you for a $500,000 or $1 million contract a year. And then you're moving up to like $2 to $5 million contract. And you can just keep progressively going up as you build your past performances. I have 3 past performances under $1 million. I have 3 past performances $1 to $5 million. I have 3 past performances that are $10 million. Each time you're doing that, it's giving the government confidence that they can prime contract to you more and more dollar values. One thing I didn't write down, but I do want to point out as it relates to prime contracting, is when you start going after prime contracts, the government will often put in an RFP a requirement that not only that you have your teaming partners are covering down on all the task areas, but that if you add any teaming partners, you have experience working with them. And so one of the things you really want to consider, even if you have smaller contracts, is to try to find strategic partners that you can bring in. Larger small businesses are a great example. A company doing 10 to 40 million, still in the small range, working with them and having them sub under you and or you subbing under them is really important to think about as you're prime contracting, because as your contracts get bigger and bigger, they want to know you have a working relationship already established. This is especially important when you're going after 50 million plus contracts. Okay, so that's the second path of the 3 paths. And let me just move on to the third path. So the first path is subcontracting under smalls. The second path is prime contracting with agencies. And this third path is subcontracting under large prime contractors, right? And so I always put this at the end because they're the most risk averse and they're the hardest to get into, right? I'm not counting those of you who worked at Booz Allen and then went back to Booz Allen or something. For the average business, 99% of us, getting to a large is the hardest thing to do. It's much harder than going to an agency and priming, because an agency has all sorts of contracts that are set aside for smalls. It's different with a large, right? They can be a lot more selective than they are. So my first thing is that they are very much demanding when they get started, and they have a right to be, right? They have to protect their reputation. Their job is to serve their customer, right? When they're getting a contract with the Army, their job is to help the Army with their mission. And so if you're coming in, they need to know that you're going to add value in helping them serve the Army, not add risk and sometimes have them have to rework behind you. There's all sorts of horror stories that large businesses tell. And there's many stories I get that we small businesses can tell. I get it. But also listen to the largest on why they have concerns. And when you listen to it, you won't be one of their horror stories. You'll be one of their heroes, right? We have a customer in our workshop right now who just got actually a Bain Group, right? They're a customer of ours and they're in our workshop, but they just got an award from a company called Burns and McDonnell. But they just got subcontractor of the year, supplier of the year, working for this multi-billion-dollar company. This company, Bain Group, is adding value to Burns and McDonnell, right? They posted it on LinkedIn. So go check out Hunter. She's in our group. I don't know if she's here today, but they posted on LinkedIn about it, and it's really exciting. Well, that's what you want to be, as a company like Bain Group that is adding value to their customers like Northrop Grumman and Burns and McDonnell. But these large primes are more demanding because they have to be. They have a lot to protect, not just the customer, the integrity of the customer work, but also the billions of dollars that they have. They can't have anything happen by a subcontractor that's going to, ruin their chances for future activity. So when I say they're demanding, and I've done a whole other training on it, but certain things, they want to know you're financially stable. They want to know that you have access to financial vehicles that enable you to cover down on all your employee expenses if payment is delayed from the government, right? They don't want you to get into a situation where you can't pay your employees leave the Army contract that you're subcontracting on, things like that, right? So there's this activity that's in there. They also want to know that you're going to contribute to the work as they go forward. They've run into situations where they'll bring a small onto their team, and the small will say, hey, we'll cover down on 10% of the people who are going to work on this contract, and then they're not able to staff up the contract. But the government doesn't care about the small. The government cares about the large prime contractor saying, how come you're not staffing up this position? We have a need here, and you said you were going to fill it if we give you the contract. We gave you the contract, you're not filling it. And the large looks over to you, but they can't look to the government and say, well, it's that small business. They're not doing it. They have to take responsibility. And so it doesn't mean they don't want to work with you, but it just means they're demanding in excellence, right, coming forward. And that's something you can achieve. I'm sure your company is good, but keep it in mind when you understand their risks or what they're worried about, then you can overcome those going in. But leading to that, I want to say, are you ready to work with large prime contractors, right? I added this to the end. This is the third path. You sub a small, you prime agency, and then you sub larges. It's the third path. And so here's a few tips on how you know if you're ready to go knocking on largest doors. And I don't mean those one-offs where you and somebody else connect and you're in, right? I mean for the average way of succeeding in the federal government world or the federal market. One tip is for knowing whether you're ready to work with a large prime contractor is, do you have agency knowledge and relationships? They call it agency intimacy, this understanding of the agency. You understand how the agency operates, their procedures and policies. You understand the people. You've developed relationships with people in there. When you have that, that's attracted to the large. That's one sign that you might be ready. Another sign is that you've subbed under small businesses already. You know what it's like to sub under a prime. They want to know that. Have you been in this position before? Do you understand the reporting? Do you understand it's not enough to have your own timekeeping tool, but you got to use ours, right? All that kind of stuff. If you've subbed under a small business, in particular for $3 million, if you've subbed under a small business, then they think, okay, then you have a general idea what it's going to be like to work with us. Another sign that you might be ready for teaming up with a large and subbing under a large is that you've prime contract at an agency, in particular at a related agency that you want to work with that large on. But if you prime contract there, then you understand the agency's requirements, whether it's security requirements, reporting requirements, billing requirements, all that kind of activity. So then when you go work for the large, they're not having to teach you everything new. You've got an understanding, and this kind of goes back to that agency intimacy. One way of understanding it is learning, doing research. Another is actually being in there and working inside the wire. And the last thing that I'll point out is, are you ready to work with large prime? And one of the things they look for is, do you have a niche? They don't want you to come in and say, hey, we do everything in construction, or we do everything in IT services. What they want is to know, where can you fit into our team? One particular area. So if there's a task area on a performance work statement that you want to go knock on the door of a large and say, hey, I could fit in, make sure you look in here and don't say, hey, we cover down on all of it. Look at one particular task area, maybe even if it's a big enough contract, one particular part of a task area, and say, we can knock that out of the park for you. We can knock it out of the park for you during proposal writing, and we can knock it out during delivery. That's niching down, right? Understand your niche factor, and it helps the large see where you can fit in their team. They can see how you can help them win the contract and how you can help them execute the contract. So that's a couple of tips on, are you ready to work with a large prime? A couple other things about subbing under a large prime contractor as a federal revenue path. One of the great things about larges is that they basically have a requirement that 30% of their revenue goes to smalls, their federal revenue. So if they win $1 billion, or let's use $100 million contract because it's easier math, but if they win $100 million contract, generally about 30% has to be subcontracted out to smalls. and the agencies are getting better and better at holding these people accountable. Well, that's $30 million. And these companies are winning billions every year. And so there's a lot of room there. If you can be a vendor like Bay & Group to Burns McDonnell, they already like you. They just gave you an award for being a great vendor. If you can be that, then you can capitalize on that trust by going to different parts of that large prime contractor. So there's a lot of room for growth in there with that 30%. The other thing is, I talked about 125 billion roughly goes to smalls. Well, roughly 500 billion goes to full and open. Yes, you can go, compete directly, but more often than not, that full and open money is going to larges, right? And so if you subcontract under a large prime, now you're getting access to that $500 billion. Let them win the whole contract, but you can go in and get a piece of it. And it doesn't take very many pieces before you've got a company that's really successful, right? And the last thing I want to just mention as it relates to larges, and I alluded to this already, but once you're in, the sky's the limit. You have this long-term relationship where you can keep developing. We have a customer in our workshop where they're doing a lot of work with one of the large primes, right? And this one I'm just holding back on the name, but it's still one of the top 5 largest primes. But they're doing it with them in the IC community. And now we have just helped them set up meetings with the same company, but with people on the civilian and DoD side. And so they're able to capitalize on 5 years of really good relationship and working together as a sub and coming over here. And this is what I mean by the sky's the limit. Now they can come over here with a proven reputation inside that large prime and just continue to grow. They don't have to go back to ground zero. This is organic sales, right? Organic growth by going from one happy part of a customer to another part of the same customer. So that's my thoughts there on large prime subcontracting subcontracting under large primes as the third revenue path. So just to recap, we talked about the 3 paths of the federal revenue success here, right? Subcontract under a small business, prime contract directly with an agency, and subcontract under a large business. And one of the tips I want to give you, as you move forward going, what can I do with this training I just learned? I want you to determine what your revenue goal is for each of these 3 paths. If you're just getting started, priming and larges is 0, right? But if you're a large company, you should look at each one of these and say, what am I doing? If you're a company doing 5 or 10 million, you're ready to have a number for each one of these. And so if you have a 2023 goal, what is your revenue goal, right, for 2023? If you've got a 2023 revenue goal, it should be broken up by these 3 paths. You should be aiming to make money on all 3 paths. That's diversification, right? And so that's my tip for you, is just determine what your revenue goal is for each one of these paths. Don't let it happen to you. Make it happen. Hey, if you found value in the training, do me a favor, throw thanks into the chat. We always appreciate that. And remember, government contracting, it is not a secret. It's just a process. I'll see you at the next training.